Today we have with us one of my early journalistic heroes, Patrick Marnham. I've been reading him for, gosh, nearly 40 years now. Patrick is a reporter, a biographer, and a screenwriter. He's written biographies of everyone from Diego Rivera to Georges Simenon and Jean Moulin, who we're going to hear a lot about today. Jean Moulin was appointed by De Gaulle to lead the French resistance. Patrick is a longtime France specialist. He's going to talk to you about the genesis of his relationship with France. He was a correspondent here for British newspapers for 12 years. He now lives near Oxford, but he continues to follow France closely. And he's just published this book, which I'm going to hold up and hope you can see it. It's a bit battered because I've read it to pieces, War in the Shadows. And War in the Shadows is about betrayal in the French resistance, betrayal of people whom Patrick knew personally. In fact, some of the first people he got to know when he got to know France over 50 years ago, and betrayal of Jean Moulin, who was arrested when the Germans mysteriously managed to discover the meeting where he was in Lyon in 1943, arrested, and very shortly after that, killed. So Patrick, here you are. Please do unmute yourself. And what prompted you to write this book? You'd written a biography of Jean Moulin 20 years ago, so why this book?
Well, the curious thing was that just after my biography of Jean Moulin was published, I received an anonymous letter. Maybe not that unusual for authors, but this was an unusual version of it because it was 16 pages long, very well typed and very well written, and the author claimed to have been in British intelligence during the war. And he told me, initially in rather flattering terms, that much as he'd enjoyed my book, I had actually missed the real solution to the question of who had betrayed the meeting in Caluire. He didn't tell me who he thought that was, but his letter was littered with intriguing clues. As it went on, it became more and more abusive and irritating. And so initially I just put it aside and thought it was an eccentric practical joke. And there it would have stayed, except for the fact that there was one little passage in the letter which seemed to me rather strange, because he said that the solution to Caluire, the mystery of Caluire, lay in a different part of the
house where Jean Moulin is the place where Jean Moulin was betrayed.
Yes, the house where he was betrayed outside Lyon. The solution lay in examining what had happened to an SOE resistance network in the Loire Valley on the same day, and if I could investigate that, I might be led towards a different conclusion about Jean Moulin and Caluire. And again, I wouldn't pay very much attention, except that I suddenly thought that I had known some people who had been in the resistance and who had lived outside Blois, in the same valley, the Loire. And I thought they had belonged to a rather small and local resistance network. And then it occurred to me that maybe they were part of this huge SOE network codenamed Prosper.
And SOE, just to be clear, is a part of the British Secret Services in World War II.
Yes, SOE was a sabotage agency set up by Churchill in 1940 after the fall of France, with the express intention, as he put it at the time, of setting Europe ablaze. And right from the start, SOE had big problems because the regular intelligence agencies were not only very protective of their own turf, but they regarded the idea of sending a lot of saboteurs into France as very worrying, because spies require discretion. They mustn't draw attention to themselves, whereas saboteurs are bound to do the opposite. So right from the start of SOE's existence, there was a tension in London between the two leading intelligence agencies active in France. Anyway, as I began to investigate, when I went back to my friends who had been in the resistance, most of whom had died, but not all by that time, I found that they had indeed been part, unknown to themselves, been sucked into this huge network. And that when they had been arrested at the time when the network was broken in June 1943.
Can we talk about how you got to know these people, how you met the resistance people of the Loire?
Yes. When I was 18, I had plans to go on an archaeological expedition in Greece between school and university. My father cancelled this at short notice and informed me that I would instead be going to stay with a family in France who he'd never met, and as far as he knew, spoke no English, and I would learn French instead. So I was packed off against my protests to this house. I drove for a day and a half, and I reached this wonderful house outside Loire. I don't know if you can see the photograph of it there now.
We're about to put up the picture of the house, which I think is called Nantes. It's kind of a dream.
Chateau Nantes, and it was it stood by a small river called the Cosson, and that is a picture of the terrace taken in 1962 when I was there. The river is behind the photographer, and that is my window, in case you're wondering, is the one at the top on the second floor, and it was a wonderful place to spend the summer. Mainly because of the family who lived there. And the house was dominated by its owner, a lady called Madame de Bernard, who was a rather severe widow with a very short temper. She could be absolutely charming, but she'd clearly seen hard times in the past. She wasn't in very good health. And if you made some terrible error, such as leaving the tennis court net up in the rain, you got into the most terrible trouble.
And she was Sugi, Mouse, and I think she's the woman sitting by the tree, in front of the tree in the back of the picture, is that right?
That's right, she's the lady in the white shirt in that photograph. Her nickname was Sugi, and she's sitting beside the other main character in the house during my visit. That photograph was taken during the war. The lady beside her in the dark cardigan is Nanny, because since 1921, Surrey had employed an English nanny. Her name was Nesta Cox, and she came to the house in 1921, and stayed there for the rest of her life. She died at the age of 92, and she was there throughout the war. In front of Nanny is her dog, Peter, and to the right, I think you can just see Surrey's second husband, Count Pierre de Bernard, who was peering at an insect through a magnifying glass. Behind them is the picnic basket. And behind the picnic basket, to the right, under the tree, is Moon, Surrey's eldest daughter, who actually taught us most of the French we learned during that summer.
Yes, because this photo was taken during the war. You arrived 20 years later, but the three women in the photograph, you knew them all in the 60s.
Yes, they all survived the war. They were all in the resistance. The Count Pierre de Bernard was also in the resistance, and he and Surrey were deported when Prospero was broken, and his health was wrecked. He died shortly afterwards. Her health was also wrecked, but she lived for 30 years after the war. And I think the fact that she was often in pain was probably one of the reasons for her very short temper.
The next slide we'll see in a moment shows the Germans who I think at some point were stationed in their house. They'd taken over parts of the chateaus. They were actually living with Germans while being in the resistance. Pamela, if you could show us that. But Patrick, what kind of resistance activities were they doing?
Well, initially, in 1940, they were drawn into resistance because one of the English students who had been with them in the 1930s escaped from a prisoner of war column, and he made his way to the only house where he thought he might be welcomed, which was Nantes. And he was welcomed, and he eventually got back to England, and he passed the address of the house back to military intelligence in London. And this is probably the reason why they were drawn into the Prospero network. But earlier on in the war, before the SOE arrived in that region, Surrey used to smuggle fugitive servicemen over the demarcation line, which was 20 miles south of Nantes. And she had many ingenious ways of doing that, acting mainly alone. She would smuggle these airmen across into Vichy France, where they had much better chance of getting to Spain and home.
Because they were in occupied France, the top part of France that was controlled by the Germans, and the demarcation line divides occupied from Vichy France.
Exactly, they were just north of the demarcation line. And after the exode, when the great flight across France of refugees, they returned to find that their house had been requisitioned by the German army. And there was quite a large detachment camped in the park. The officers took over the second floor and established themselves up there. And this seems to be a negotiation in this photograph between some of the officers and Monsieur and Madame de Bernard, who were on the left facing the warrant officer in the background. They seem to have arrived in a requisitioned car. That's a Citroën. They were fast cars. German army cars are grey, and they abrogated these cars and because they were faster. That photograph was taken completely illegally by Moon, my French teacher, who at the time was about 17, and she took it from behind some curtains on the first floor. If she'd been caught, she might have been shot.
So as the war progresses, as you say, SOE in England is sending in people by plane, landing them in France to do sabotage work. And your friends are helping these people as they arrive and helping to hide them and equip them. Is that right? Is that their role?
Well, in 1942, the whole thing changed. Instead of just helping the odd fugitive across the line, SOE agents arrived in the Touraine and they recruited the family, the de Bernard family, into SOE. And then saboteurs were then sent by parachute or by light aircraft into France. And Nantes became one of their safe houses. And they began to play quite an active part in a very active sabotage unit in that area. Nanny, for instance, the extraordinary thing about Nanny was she went on living side by side with the German troops throughout the occupation. She had a radio hidden in the cupboard in her bedroom, which was totally illegal, and she fielded BBC coded messages, many of which were passed on to the local SOE network, which would explain when the next arms drop by parachute was expected and where it would be.
And the Germans knew that this was an Englishwoman living in the house with them?
Yes, they did. And well, the German troops really weren't particularly interested in that. They just saw a rather inoffensive, smiling lady with a little dog, which became a great friend with the German police dogs, and who spoke a rather unusual form of French. And they didn't regard her as in any form a threat. And if there were any questions, Madame de Bernard simply said she was an English orphan who lived with them and had done for many years. And she was never bothered. She was also protected by the mayor of the commune, who didn't list her as an expatriate.
So you've described them as the Prosper Network. We're about to see a picture of Prosper. Could you tell us about who he was and what the Prosper Network was?
Yes, Prosper Network was in 1942 and 1943 the largest SOE network in France. Francis Suttle, who was the leader of it, was a very effective resistance organizer, and he quickly built the network up using to some extent contacts already known to London, and it stretched from north of Paris down to the Loire and along the Loire Valley, and numbered hundreds and hundreds of members. It was far too big by the end. And he was a very remarkable, charismatic man. He became quite worried towards the middle of 1943 about the security of his network. and he didn't know, but it was an unfortunate fact, that among the first contacts he was given was an earlier network called CART. And CART was broken by the German police in November 1942. So in fact, many of his contacts were tainted shortly after his arrival.
Just on Francis Suttle, he spoke perfect French to the degree that he could pass as French, didn't he? How was that?
He spoke perfect French to the point he could pass as Belgian. He was Anglo-French, but he'd grown up in England and his accent was a little rusty. So he never had any trouble with that. He was a fluent French speaker. That was because his mother was French and his father was English. He was actually a barrister. And when he joined SOE, he was under the impression he was joining the special forces and was being trained as a commando. Not until right at the end did he realize he was going to be leading a sabotage network in France. He spoke much better French than most of the English agents SOE sent into France.
Now, we're about to come to a crucial man in this story, Dere. I think Henri Dere, he's the next picture of Hamlet. Can you tell us a bit about him?
Henri Dere is a very mysterious figure. Before the war, he was an expert pilot. He would give exhibitions at flying shows. He spoke German and English. He didn't go to university. He was absolutely fascinated by aircraft. He was not taken prisoner in 1940, but before the war, he'd made friends with German civilian pilots. And when they arrived in France after the defeat, he regained contact with his former friends, regained contact. And he was in fact reintroduced to a policeman he'd known before the war called Bermelberg. And Bermelberg was the head during the war of the SD, the SS Internal Intelligence Service in Paris. And Bermelberg recruited him and invited him to be well paid and to make his way to England as though he were a resistor and to try to penetrate some British intelligence network which he could supply Bermelberg with information about. So Dere did this. He managed to get down to the south of France. He joined an escape line. He arrived in England with a false story that he'd already been checked over in North Africa and invited to go back and fly for the resistance, or fly for Free French. But he was in fact immediately spotted on arrival as a likely German agent. And he was picked up by MI5 immediately.
MI5, the Internal Security Service of the Brits. So Dere was working for the Gestapo, and the Brits actually find that out. They establish that to their satisfaction that Dere is a Gestapo man. And yet...
The only people who actually find that out are SIS, the Secret Intelligence Service, the rival service to SOE. MI5, the security agency, are kept completely in the dark. And you can see, by going through the papers in London, you can see that they keep on writing to the Ministry of Defense, saying this man is not straightforward. He's a possible German agent. He must not be allowed anywhere near our intelligence agencies. And this goes on for a year. Meanwhile, Dere has been infiltrated into SOE by SIS, and he becomes the air movements officer for Prospero Network and is parachuted into France. And
this is a horrible, convoluted story of a man who is infiltrated into one British spying agency by the other while working for the Gestapo, which SIS knows. Okay, so in 1943, this man, this double agent, is SOE's flight officer, so he's welcoming in flights coming from England.
Yes, he is in charge of all air movements into and out of occupied France, in central France.
Right. Okay. So at this extremely sensitive point, and the summer of 1943 is when everything goes horribly wrong.
Yes.
So,
sorry.
Tell us how your friend's network, the Prosper network, is blown that summer.
The Prosper network was blown in June, and initially because the welcoming parties in the Sologne, outside round Nantes, were receiving more and more arms drops. They were coming in at a furious pace, and they were really very hard pressed to transport these arms, hide them, and prepare them to be used when the débarquement took place. They asked SOE to give them a rest, to give them a break. The flights were coming in far too frequently, and they were exhausted. They asked Prosper, Francis Suttle, to give them a break, but he declined. He said, no, that wasn't possible. It was a matter of extreme urgency. The frequency of the flights attracted the attention of the German military commander in Loire. And with the help of the Gestapo, he set a trap in the Sologne on the night of the 20th or 21st of June, 1943. And it was quite a large ambush running around several communes. And into that ambush drove the local leader of the resistance, a friend of the Madame de Bernard, called Pierre Cuglioli, who had just welcomed two new recruits sent by SOE, two Canadians who didn't speak very good French. They drove straight into the middle of this ambush. They were taken to the town hall, and where the Gestapo were established. And Pierre Cuglioli and his female assistant, a woman called Yvonne Roudela, who was French, were very quickly cleared and invited to leave. The Canadians were immediately caught, which meant that Cuglioli and Yvonne Roudela were also caught after a car chase. She had a bullet in her head, which she kept there until she died. It was never removed. And in the boot of the car was all the information, the radio crystals and weapons, which these two Canadians had brought with them to set up a new network. So that was the beginning. The arresting officers took Cuglioli to Paris, and they found in the papers in the boot of the car the address where, in fact, Prosper and his number two, Gilbert Norman, were using as a safe house. And that later that night, they caught Gilbert Norman, who was a radio operator. And on the following day, they caught Prosper.
And they also caught your friends, Souris and Pierre.
That happened later. Initially, they just caught these professional SOE agents and took them into the Avenue Foch, and we don't know exactly what happened there. We do know that they attempted to remain silent for as long as they could. And then a terrible error occurred, because when a radio operator was caught, he had a double blind in his messages. His first code blind signal in the message indicated all was well. He had to put that deliberate error in. If he didn't put the second deliberate error in, it meant that he was no longer a free man.
This is when he was signaling back to London that he had arrived.
Yes. Yeah. The Gestapo immediately put a gun to his head and told him to start signaling. So of course he omitted his second code, and almost at once got a message back from London, from the head of F section, the French section of SOE, saying, "You've omitted your second code. This is a very serious error. Do not let it occur again." at which point Norman became persuaded that there was a German agent working at Baker Street at SOE headquarters in London, and he began to cooperate with the Gestapo in Paris.
I'm just going to interrupt you there to say where we are now. So it's summer 1943, the Salon network has been rolled up. Suspiciously, the air movements officer that they're using to land the aircraft is a Gestapo agent, known to parts of British intelligence. Also, Francis Suttle, the head of the network, has been told by the Brits, or has been hinted at by the Brits, that actually the Normandy landings might happen quite soon. They might happen later that year, 1943, and so we need to send all this stuff to France. That's why there's this urgency to keep landing weapons in France. So it's being given to understand to the local resistors there could be Normandy landings quite soon, or landings by the Allies quite soon, D-Day 1943. So here we are in the Loire in 1943, June, and at exactly the same time, in Lyon, to the southeast, there is another meeting happening. Now, these two stories come together, the Loire and the Jean Moulin story in your book. So tell us about Jean Moulin, because this is the point where he enters the story.
Yes, well, Jean Moulin was a prefect before the war. He was the prefect of the Eure-et-Loire, prefect in Chartres. And he was dismissed by the Vichy regime because he was known to be an opponent of the right in France. He was a man of the left. So he then started to travel around France, both in the occupied and the Vichy zone, gathering information which would be useful for a resistance organization. He then managed to make his way to London, and he met General De Gaulle, and he was sent back to France as General de Gaulle's delegate and chief organizer to the resistance of the interior. He carried out his first mission successfully, returned to London, and was briefed to return to France and to start a second mission, by which time he had managed to pull all the disparate political movements in the wider resistance into a loosely federated organization. He was very, 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 very good at remaining undercover. You never contacted Jean Moulin. You sent a message which he would pick up through intermediaries, and he would then contact you if he chose to. And by this stage, in June 1943, he had actually managed to call together the first meeting of the National Resistance Council, which united politicians and resistance leaders of both left and right under a Gaullist umbrella.
Because de Gaulle wanted to control the resistance, and everyone could see this is going to be very important for post-war France. Who controlled the resistance was likely to control the country. Yes,
this was de Gaulle's great use, actually, in London, when he didn't have an army or a united country to represent, but he needed the resistance to be his, because then he could plausibly claim to be the leader of the Free French. And Jean Moulin delivered the resistance to him and effectively gave him a huge boost vis-a-vis those who didn't admire him so much, including Roosevelt and Churchill, who found him a very difficult character. So that was the situation in June 1943. And he's at that stage, there was another problem, because the military head of the resistance, a man called General Delestrin, Charles Delestrin, was caught by the Germans, and Jean Moulin had to appoint a successor. And the meeting called in Caluire was to discuss who should be the successor and military leader of the resistance.
Yeah, they called the meeting at this very picturesque, very French house just outside Lyon, at a doctor's house. And the various resistors come together there. Jean Moulin is picked up and I think taken by tram to this house. you actually met the doctor 40 years later, Dr. Dugujon, whose house it was. So just sketch a little bit now that we can see the house. Where is everything happening? All these resistors are coming together, the main people in the French resistance for this meeting.
Right. Well, that house is in the center of the suburb of Caluire. It is the house of everyone's doctor. He's a very prominent citizen, and his consulting room is in the two windows facing the cameraman on the first floor. There's a terrace to the left. You can't see it through the ivy, and that was where the front door was. And throughout that day, patients were coming and going. The waiting room was at the far end of the house on the first floor, and Dr. Dugujon was consulting behind those two windows. The meeting was held on the room above him, the one where the blinds are closed in this photograph. And when I went to meet Dr. Dugujon, which was in 1985, he was semi-retired and very upset because he was worried. The officer the Gestapo officer who had arrested all the resistors in his house had just been caught in Bolivia, brought back to France, and was about to be tried in Lyon. And he was brought back, that's Klaus Barbie, you see him there.
Some of you will remember his trial, I certainly do.
Yes, and he was brought back, the impending trial had brought back all the memories of the war to Dr. Dugujon. And he kept the curtains of those two windows closed on a hot summer's day throughout our meeting. The room was in semi-darkness. He was clearly very tense and nervous. And he did not like the way in which he thought that the trial would allow Barbie to destroy the reputation of the resistance. So that was Dr. Dugujon in 1985.
Okay, so there are these 8 or 9 or so resistors in the house. There are many theories about who might have betrayed the meeting to Barbie and the Germans. We won't go into all those details. They are fascinating in your book. And so when the Germans raid, when they arrive in the house, where is Jean Moulin?
Well, most of the members of the meeting are sitting at the top floor where they've been for half an hour waiting for Jean Moulin to arrive. This was breaking a fundamental rule of resistance meetings. You never waited beyond 15 minutes maximum. If the meeting, if everyone was not present, you left, but they stayed. And Jean Moulin, when he arrived, was shown by what was described as a confused maid into the patient's waiting room with 2 other people who had arrived late. So there were 3 resistors standing in the waiting room among mainly female patients, and 5 more resistors upstairs twiddling their thumbs, wondering what is going on. 3 or 4 minutes after Jean Moulin's arrival, the Gestapo burst into the house and arrest everyone and take them down to headquarters in Lyon. There are a great number of questions about all those facts I've just given you. I don't know if you want me to go into any of them at the moment.
No, the different resistors at the meeting and who might have betrayed, it's too complicated to go into now. Read the book. Jean Moulin is then tortured and put on a train, dies of a heart attack on the train even before it has left France. I mean, this is one of the most discussed meetings in French history, you know, what happened, who did what. But can you just say a little bit about the status of Jean Moulin now in French history, how he is remembered?
Well, he is one of the great figures of the war. He's a national hero. Because he wasn't broken by the Gestapo. He died after torture. He was a quite remarkable man. And he was, in a sense, beatified by André Malraux, I think in 1962, in an extraordinary speech made outside the Pantheon when the ashes of Jean Moulin were transferred to the National Mausoleum And the film of that speech is available still on the internet. And until then, Jean Moulin had been relatively unknown, but after that he became, quite rightly, one of the great national heroes for his courage and suffering.
And there are streets and
He's
schools.
the emblem of the resistance, really. Yes, there are streets named and statues to him all over France.
So the French historians have spent 75 years trying to work out who betrayed Jean Moulin, how did the Gestapo know? And they've mostly looked at French potential culprits. Now you took a different approach, and you may be the first person who has looked at the British secret services for clues as to how Jean Moulin was betrayed. So can you talk a bit about how you did that?
Well, I did that simply by going through any archive I could find and reading every single document I could drag out. But this takes me back to the letter, because clearly the purpose of my inquiry is to find out what on earth could be connecting the events in the Loire Valley and the events in Lyon. And the widely accepted traitor of Caluire was one of the resistors who had previously been arrested by the Gestapo and had concealed that fact. But what struck me as very strange about the whole story was that one woman actually admitted leading the Gestapo to the house. She was never put on trial. She was a prosecution witness for the other resistor, René Hardy, and she was the only person who was quite happy to admit that she'd been working for both the resistance and the Gestapo at the time. What I discovered was that she was a member of various resistance organizations, including one that was run by SIS from Geneva.
And SIS is the British Secret Intelligence Service, to repeat that.
Yes.
Yeah.
So here we have a woman who is actually an SIS agent, who is actually the person who leads Barbie to the house in Caluire. And I wanted to find out why she wasn't tried after the war. And I found out that her commander, her local commander, a very dubious character called Colonel Groussard, who had been a pre-war member of the Cagoule and had a face to match.
Cagoule, far-right kind of terrorist organization.
Far-right, pre-war, pro-fascist terrorist organization. Colonel Groussard confirmed her story that when she was arrested by the Gestapo and reported this fact to him, he authorized her to remain in contact with the Gestapo. So we have Colonel Groussard, we have Madame de la Traze, the name of the lady in question. We have behind Colonel Groussard the SIS man in Geneva, who was called Victor Farrell. And in front of Colonel Groussard and Madame de la Traze, we have a man called Benouville, who was not at the meeting, was not invited to the meeting, loathed Jean Moulin, and actually sent René Hardy, who had already been arrested by the Gestapo, to the meeting, although he hadn't been invited there. So it was quite a tangle to unravel. And the fifth part of my book is the unraveling of that tangle.
Yeah, it's a fascinating detective story, and SIS's fingerprints appear to be suspiciously on this. I won't go into too much detail, but why would the Brits want to betray Jean Moulin to the Germans? What possible motive could they have for betraying the head of the French resistance to the Germans?
Well, whether they did or they didn't, and I'm not going to confirm either at this stage. I'd rather you read the book because it's a very complex story. The fact is that De Gaulle and his emissary, Jean Moulin, were opposing Allied policy about the organization of the resistance. London regarded it as extremely dangerous to centralize the resistance organization in 1943. It meant that if you broke the center, you broke the whole organization. They wanted it divided up into regional areas. And on the grounds of security. So Jean Moulin's triumph in uniting it in the National Resistance Council was far from welcome in London. That's just a political point, of course. That's not a reason to have him arrested. For that, you'll have to read more in the book.
Yes, I'm loath to give away too much. I'm torn between going into some of these fascinating details and giving away too much. Instead, let's go to the post-war. So Pierre and Souris, the people of the House of Nantes, they actually return.
Yes, their report, well, Pierre returns and he's, as you can see, in a terrible state. He's been in Buchenwald. Nanny was looking after him because the doctor told her what to do. She had to give him injections and said that his skin was so thin it was almost impossible to do that. And Souris was reported to be dead and confirmed as dead more than once. But she did eventually return because she'd been looked after by the Swedish Red Cross, who managed to get a convoy of French prisoners out of Ravensbrück a few weeks before it was liberated. And they took the sickest people to Sweden, where Souris' life was saved by the Swedish Red Cross. And she returned. It took them both over a year to recover enough health to welcome any visitors to the house.
So how did they deal with the war or not? I mean, their friends had been betrayed. They'd lost many, many people. Others like them returned broken. When you arrived on the scene nearly 20 years later, how had they digested all that?
Well, by then Pierre de Bernard had died. Madame de Bernard did not talk of the war. Nanny occasionally would have some happy memory about her radio or her dog, but the war was not discussed. I once plucked up my courage and asked her about Ravensbrück, a very stupid thing to do, but I did it because I was 18 years old, and she just made a joke of it and changed the subject. Before I left, Moon, her daughter, had started to organize an exhibition which was intended to raise money for the people who had returned from deportation. And that's when it was a photographic exhibition, and that's when I really got a first clear impression of the horrors of that period. But people didn't talk about the war in 1962 in France. It led to too many ferocious arguments. I remember that on the mantelpiece in Nantes, in the dining room, there were two photographs. One was a very handsome framed photograph of an army officer, instantly recognizable as General De Gaulle, by that time the President of the Republic. And the other was a little passport sort of photograph of a woman with a wonderful smile and a streak of gray in her brown hair. And that was Jacqueline, the resistor who was shot in the head, who was a frequent visitor to Nantes, SOE agent, first one sent into France by SOE. And on one occasion, we were taken sometimes to a neighboring house inhabited by a lady called Madame de Salier-Dupin, the widow of a general. And I asked Madame de Bernard whether there was a picture of Jacqueline on Madame de Salier-Dupin's mantelpiece as well. This caused a great deal of mirth. The idea that the widow of a Petanese general would have her photograph was amusing enough and quite cheering, really, because it meant that they were starting to make friends again after the war.
I'm coming to audience questions in a moment, but I just want to ask you, how did you feel unearthing all this, given your personal connections to the family, given the importance of Jean Moulin in French history? As you started digging into solutions, what was your personal feeling?
Well, I was actually so absorbed in trying to work out how you could explain this mess that I didn't at the time really have many personal feelings. I had to clear what I was doing with Frederic Dere, who owns Nantes today and is Madame de Bernard's grandson. And he was quite happy for me to carry out this investigation. Initially, I was appalled by the suggestion that anyone in London might have been involved in the breaking of Prospero. But it's some of those who were arrested actually didn't think it was such a bad thing, if that was the truth. And they said they must have been just fighting a different battle to the one they thought they were engaged in. And they were very generous about it.
I'm going to come to questions now. Please do send more in, people. We have a couple from, I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, Chamaret. Who did the family think betrayed them?
They thought, they were pretty clear that they'd been betrayed by Henri Dericourt, who was tried after the war in Paris.
The flight agent.
The air movements officer, exactly. When the Gestapo left Avenue Foch, they left a lot of papers behind, and these proved beyond a doubt that he'd been paid by them. He was due for conviction and execution, and his life was saved by a last-minute witness, identified simply as a British intelligence officer, who was in fact the deputy head of F Section SOE, who vouched for him and said that he had known and authorized Dericourt to be in touch with the Gestapo. That was quite untrue, incidentally. This man didn't have the authority to do that, but that saved Dericourt's life. He left France immediately after the trial and wasn't knowingly seen there again. Had they caught him in the salon, he would have probably ended his life there and then.
In fact, he died in Laos, didn't he?
He died, he was reported to have died in 1962 in November in an air crash in Laos, where he was flying aircraft which were running gold and drugs and arms in and out of the Laotian highlands. This report was not always accepted as accurate in the Salon, but they couldn't get, there's no body was found. But that was his official death certificate, yes.
Another question from Chamaret about the other leg of your story. Barbie was presumably interrogated at his trial about Jean Moulin's arrest. What did he say about that?
Oh, he said he found Barbie very charming. He'd never harmed him. Unfortunately, his vigilance had escaped for a moment, and Jean Moulin had managed to throw himself over the central staircase in the military medical school and caused himself severe brain damage, which accounted for the state he was in when he was taken to Paris. Nobody believed a word of it.
And in fact, Barbie had screwed up because he wasn't supposed to kill a valuable witness before he had coughed up the story, which Jean Moulin didn't.
No, he was not supposed to do that to him at all. And they were very angry. Bernard was furious in Paris, but the nurse who was with Jean Moulin when he died said afterwards that it was perfectly clear he hadn't just suffered brain injuries by a suicide attempt. He had been severely beaten before that.
And I mean, Barbie was presumably asked, how did you know that they were all in Dr. Dugujon's house? Do you know if this came up at the trial and what Barbie said about that?
Well, Barbie had given various versions over the years. By the time the trial started, he was blaming a man called Raymond Aubrac, who was a communist resistor who was arrested with Jean Moulin in the waiting room on that day. And he decided to tell the world that actually it was Aubrac who was working for him. He denied, but earlier on he'd said it was René Hardy, who was the man generally thought to have done it.
And the house in Collioure is now a museum, a Jean Moulin museum?
Yes, it is now a museum. It's empty of furniture. It is now a museum. They've put some 1940s medical equipment in Dr. Dugujon's consulting room. The last time I saw it, and it is now a museum which is mainly visited, I think, by local school children who would like to know more about the war.
Last two questions, one from Michael Richmond. Have French historians seen your book yet, and what has been their reaction, if so?
No, I haven't had any reaction from French historians yet.
Well, that's to come. I mean, the book has only just appeared, hasn't it?
Yes, yes. It hasn't been translated into French anymore.
I found it a fantastic read and hugely illuminated my understanding of the complexity of French World War II, so I would recommend it. And that's my last question for you, Patrick, is after 60 years nearly of engagement with France, how would you describe your relationship with France?
My wife is half French, my children are French. It's my favorite place.
So, say more than that.
Well, some of the happiest years of our life was spent in Paris when I was the independent correspondent. Our son was born there. My daughter grew up there. We made some wonderful friends there. I love writing about French politics. They are so cynical and, well, sort of spicy, really, compared to the hypocrisy we put up with in my own country. It's a wonderful pageant. We all miss President Mitterrand very much. He was the master chess player, but it was a great time to be reporting politics from France when he was in power.
Yes, your previous collection, Crime and the Académie Française, really helped me understand France in the 70s and 80s. If I recall rightly, you talk about Barbie in that book as well.
Yes.
Collection published many, many years ago. Okay, thank you very, very much, everyone. Thank you.